I'm Jo Avery. I'm a quilt designer and teacher from in Edinburgh, and I'm here to talk to you about some applique today, needle turn applique. So we're going to do everything by hand, and I'm using some blocks from the Red Manor House block of the month. We can start off with this lovely flower pot block here, and the thing about needle turn applique is that you have to sew down the edges, but you have to turn under the edges at the same time, and this can be what's a bit tricky for people. It comes with dexterity, but there are a few little tips and tricks we can use to help prepare the pieces before you stitch them down. So here's one that I've started, and I'm going to add some little bits in here, another one of the circles and another leaf, but I'm just going to show you how I would have started this off right from the beginning. So I always start with a larger piece of fabric than the block actually needs, because when you're working by hand, you're going to be doing it for a little while and the edges are going to get frayed probably. So it's better to give yourself that little extra area that you can then trim it down later. But because of that, I want to make sure I'm getting stuff in the middle. So I've pressed a centre square here, centre guidelines before I start, just so I can place things properly. So, you know, on your pattern for this block, you will have a picture that you can use as a guide. But what we've got is we've got some little stems that we're going to put in first, and then a flower pot that's going to go on top. So these bits need to go down first. And these are really nice and easy to do because they're just straight edges. So what we can do with these is we can just finger press the edges over like this, and you know, they're just a guide really. You want, I would say, a scant 1/4 inch seam. If they're smaller pieces, you're going to use a slightly smaller seam, possibly about 3/16 of an inch. But you know, most of the time it doesn't matter too much. You don't want too little, certainly. Don't go below 3/16 of an inch, and don't go more than a 1/4 inch. But you know, this is a hand piece. It's not absolutely accurate. You know, you're not piecing things together. So we just want this you can be organic with this. So that would be really nice and easy for me to do if I was going to start sewing this bit first. I can turn down these edges here. So I'm just using my nails to press it because it's going to be quite fiddly, even though they're nice easy straight lines, to press them on the iron. And then we'll just pin these down and we could start sewing up and down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the actual stitch that you're going to use for, which I use anyway for needle turn applique, which is a tiny slip stitch, and it's very similar to what you do when you're binding, and I'm sure most of you have used it already, but I just want to go through a few bits about it that are going to make it a little bit easier for you to do. So I'm going to use this flower pot as an example. So I'm just going to turn one of the edges under here. We're going to pin this on. You know, I'll come back to this later to make it look wonderful. But to start with, we just want something that we can show you the stitch with, and then we're going to go on to that bit. So I'm going to use a completely contrasting thread to do this because I want you to be able to see the stitch. Normally I would use a matching thread, and the thread I'm using as well is an 80 weight Aurifil thread. You can of course use just a regular 50 weight thread, but this finer thread has been designed specifically for applique, and it really does make your stitches melt away. So if you're a little bit unsure about your stitching and you want to do neat stitches, then I would definitely recommend that. And if you're going to buy just one colour, I would go for this pale grey because it pretty much matches in with anything. The next thing I want to talk about is your needle. So if you want to have nice, fine, small stitches, you want a nice, fine needle. And I like to use this Straw Milliner's number 10. My favourite make is Millward's, so because I think they're lovely and fine, but they're actually really reasonable. These are tiny. I lose them all the time, so I don't want to spend too much on a needle because I'm going to get through too many of them. So what I'm going to do is, just to start off here, I'm going to put a few stitches on top of each other through the back here where you're not going to see it. If you prefer, you can just do a knot, but I just like to put maybe 2 or 3 stitches on so I've got it secure. And then we're going to come up through here and we're going to start to stitch. So what we want to do is we want to come up very close to the fold there, just a couple of stitches from the fold, and we're going to do one tiny stitch which catches the edge. My analogy for this is that this folded edge is like the curb on a street, and I'm going straight down into the gutter and slightly under the gutter to do a stitch. And then I want to take a longer stitch that's going all the way through to the back, and my travelling stitch, the stitch that's going to take us between these little stitches, is on the back. So you can see it there. I'll show it again when I get going. And it's just a tiny stitch here. It's not a slanty stitch, so when I put the next one in, I don't want to slant and do a stitch here or backwards or whatever. It's a tiny stitch that goes over the curve into the gutter, slightly under the curve if possible, and then a stitch away that catches just the edge of the stitch here. And then if you give it a little bit of a pull just to make sure that it's secure, you don't want it to pucker, but you also don't want them to be loose, because the loose stitches, you're going to see them. If you can keep this straight little stitch here and not do any slanty stitches, and if you can pull them so they're not loose, you shouldn't really see the stitch. So you see that first one I started there was a little bit too far from the fold. I've got closer in here. Hopefully you can still see these stitches because I'm using a matching thread. But you can see how they're almost invisible even though I'm using a matching thread. They're just tiny stitches. The space between the stitches needs to be between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. I don't think you need your stitches to be any smaller than 1/4 of an inch, and they shouldn't be any bigger than 1/4 of an inch. No smaller than 1/8 of an inch, no bigger than 1/4 of an inch. And basically, you know, you're not sewing this isn't going to take any strain. It's not like a seam that's between two pieces. All it's doing is holding this down here. So, and on straighter pieces like this, your stitches can be a little bit further apart than they can be when you're doing a curved edge, when you need to make them a bit closer together. So hopefully you get the idea. Let's look at the back, and you can see my very bad knot which wasn't in the right place, but then you can see the stitches, how they're longer stitches there. All the travelling is being done through the back, and this is just a catching stitch here, very close to the fold. Okay, so now we've had a go at that, we know what we're doing. We're going to look at some ways to prepare these pieces. So I'm going to leave that alone here. And I'm going to go over to this bit, and we're going to look at a way of doing the circles. So I'm going to grab some more of this grey, which is a great universal thread for all the colours. Though what I would say is, if you haven't got any of the 80 weight, or you have got the 80 weight but you've only got the grey and you've got the perfect yellow for this, then you might be better off using a slightly thicker thread but a matching one than using one that you're going to be able to see, and that's finer. So what I'm going to do is to create a gathering stitch which is going to go around this paper template. So I've used the templates for the pieces, but this one I've cut out without the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is the actual size that this circle is going to end up being. They're not actually quite circles, they're sort of ovally, slightly wonky shapes, which I really like, but this one's almost circular. So I'm going to start stitching. I'm going to put a few stitches on top of each other, and I find that I can get away with using this fine thread for this as well. It's not going to break or anything. It doesn't take too much strain with the gather. And I'm going to do some tiny little gathering stitches. They want to be about 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge. So my seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch, and I want this row of gathering stitches to be halfway between the raw edge and where this paper is going to sit. I actually really like this little gathering stitch. I find this really pleasing to do. There's other ways you can do this. I'm going to show you another way with some card and foil in a bit, and that's another way you can treat circles. Circles, curved edges are kind of the hardest thing to do if you're just going to turn the edges under as you go. So I always like to prepare them with some gathering stitches with these, either this paper method or the card and foil method, so that I can get some perfect curves. So we're nearly all the way around. Okay, and we want to sort of stretch that out properly so that we can check that this goes in the right place. As I said, this is one's almost circular, but some of the others are more oval, so you've got to make sure you're getting it in the right place. And then we're just going to gather it up like this. Gather it up, and I'm gathering it too much really here, because I'm just going to put like a tension stitch in, one little stitch, so that I can bend it back but the whole thing won't collapse. And then I'm going to put another one in, and that's it. Now, you know, it's not really going to fall apart. I go one more and we're done. I'm going to take my thread out to the fold, and I'm going to go and just very quickly press this. So I've pressed that both sides, so I've got a nice crisp edge, and I'm going to pop the paper out now. Now, if you were going to make a few of these, you can actually reuse this quite a few times. I've used them about 10 times for this particular reason, but and I might use it for the other blocks, so I'll hang on to that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pin this down. You'll see that I've still got a raw edge on this one here. Because I knew I was going to cover this over with another bit of applique, I didn't need to turn the edges under for that. I'll put a couple of bits in. These pins that I'm using are specifically for applique. They're clover applique pins, and they're so tiny that they're really beneficial for applique, because what happens with larger pins is you're constantly catching your thread around them, which is really annoying. So we're going to just now use that same stitch we did before, except I'm using a matching thread now, so you won't be able to see it so much, to sew this down. So nice and easy now, you can just whip around this because you've got all your edges turned under. One thing I would point out, this has happened, this is a nice small one, it's all turned under really nicely. Occasionally your gathers get a little fold within the seam, and you get what looks like a little spike here, or a little jaggy bit. What you can do is you can get your needle into the seam and sort of pull it and push it one way or the other. So you can, even though you've prepared these edges and they're nicely turned under, you can still control it, and you can still smooth out curves by getting your needle into the seam. And hopefully you can just see how I can control that seam with my needle from the back of it. Okay, and then we can just go all the way around that. I'm not going to go all the way around that because I want to show you leaves now and how to deal with some leaves. So I'm going to leave that for later, and we're going to look at leaves. So this leaf is meant to go here. I'm going to put that on there. It's the biggest out of all the leaves. I think it'll be easier to show you this one than any of the others. So I'm halfway around this one at the moment, but I'm going to look at this. So we've looked at how if you've got straight edges, you can just turn the edges under. If you've got circles, you can use paper. So this is another little method for using more awkward shapes like the leaf. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this bit of leather, and I'm going to use a straight edge tracing wheel to score a crease in my leaf. Now you don't have to use leather if you haven't got any. This is a bit of an old handbag. You can use some felt, you can use a computer mouse mat, anything like that that's got a bit of a give to it. And so this is a straight edge tracing wheel rather than a serrated one. And what we do is just by eye, with our 1/4 inch seam, we just score it around, and it's actually really fun to do. You can also use any sort of creasing tool for this, like a hero marker, but the wheel's just more fun, I think. And you can see how it's, hopefully you can see it's given us that little guide that's going to make the whole thing easier to manage when we start to sew it, because we've got that score already. So I'm going to put it about here, knowing that all of this edge here is going to get turned under, and I want my point to be up against the stem there. So I'm going to get some more of my little pins, put them in, and we're going to start to sew this, because the next thing I want to show you is how to deal with the points at the edge of, what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to use this, come up here, that's all ready to go. The points at the corners of the leaf, because that's the tricky bit. So this, we've got a nice gentle curve here. We can turn this around like this, and it's going to go exactly where I just scored it. And we'll start to sew our nice little stitches, as I showed you before. Now, you can also pinch this to get an extra thing. If you didn't want to score those edges, you can just pinch them. You can just do this ahead, pin it on, pinch it around, and you'll get the same sort of effect, just maybe not so much fun. So before we get to this, we really want to stop about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch before we do a couple more stitches, and then you don't want to get too close to your point before you do this little maneuver. So we've got to deal with this dog ear that we're going to get here. So what I'm going to do is, this is folded along this way because I'm going this way, but I'm going to refold it, open it out like that, fold it that way for the other side, and then fold it back over so that I get my dog ear on this side. This way I can now run right up to this point without having to worry about it. So a few more stitches take us up to the point. Okay, and then we're going to turn it around to go back the other way. And now we have to do a little maneuver that I like to think of as rolling, and it's a sort of roll and a fold to get this dog ear under here. Now if this, you can trim it a little bit. I'm going to trim a little bit off it like this, but if you trim too much you won't be able to get it underneath. You'll make it unmanageable. So don't be tempted to trim too much of it off. So what I do is I sort of fold it around like this with my needle, poke it underneath, and I keep poking it like this. I can get it in that way, and you can see that it's disappeared. And now I'm going to do more. The stitches here I'm going to be closer together because I want to make sure it's nicely trapped under that seam. So I'll put a few here, and that gives you this lovely point. Takes a little bit of practice. When the first time you do it, you might find that a little tricky, but it will come very quickly with some practice. And we'll just work our way around the whole of the leaf like that. So that's a few different ways of preparing the leaf and the circle and getting started with applique.